I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Apasa Cafe, our nearly monthly colloquium featuring cutting-edge Anabaptist scholarship. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation with Samuel Boucher, who will be sharing more with us in a talk titled Global Anabaptism, Navigating a Transnational Religio-Ethnic Network. To begin with, I'd like to thank Andrea Waxmunski, an integral member of our APASA Scholarship Committee. She is the one who is managing all the technology to make this event possible. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, please save your questions for the end of the presentation or put them in the chat. Our presenter is going to be speaking for about a half an hour, and that should then allow us plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. If you do participate in the conversation after the presentation, your questions and comments will be recorded, and those recordings will be available on our website, which you can check out, including previous APASA cafes, at amishstudies.org. If you are joining us by phone and would like to ask a question, please unmute by pushing *6. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Samuel Boucher. Samuel, thank you for being with us today and sharing some of your work. I'll give you the floor.
All right, thank you very much. I'm just going to share something in the chat real quick, and then I'll share my screen for my PowerPoint presentation. So in the chat, for those of you who are interested in looking at other stuff besides my presentation, I have some links for some of the data sets that I'm going to be working with, including 2 interactive maps that will be very fun. One of the links is in German, but the other one should just be an interactive map because that's kind of what I am working with at the moment right now. Okay, let's begin. Yep. Share screen. Share. Okay, everyone can see this all right? Okay, perfect. So global Anabaptism. So briefly about myself, I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Iowa. I focus mainly on the Mennonites in Latin America, in particular their economic history. So business history, Mennonite co-ops, and I'm particularly interested in how they've been economically successful. So brief presentation outline. I'm going to show you the data, which is what I've pretty much just shared on the screen, the links. I might get into the maps a little bit later if there's time, but I'm just going to kind of go through this as it is right now. My research question, some possible answers that have come up for this question. One particular answer I'm going to be going into, which is world systems theory. I'm going to give a brief overview of Mennonite migration history, and then talk about how world systems theory can help us understand Mennonite economic success due to regional systems. So this is just the data. This is one, I believe he's German, Andreas Thiessen. So he's done massive studies on Mennonites in Russia and Mennonite settlements in Russia. So that link, I guess I can just show it real quick right now. No, I can't because I can't see that right now. Okay, I'll just show it a little bit after. So yeah, that website links to his website, which that website's the link is in English, but then it links to the website, which is in German. But I think a lot of people here probably know at least a little bit of German. And then with the wonders of technology, you can just Google Translate the page and kind of find the map. But at the end of the presentation, I'll go on the page and show you where the map is located. But it just has Google Maps and pins all the different locations of Mennonite settlements throughout Central Asia and Russia. My migration data from a certain Corey Anderson, Dr. Corey Anderson. He's done a lot of demographic data of Amish settlements and Plains settlements in North America. Again, very great impact, good data set. And then this next data, I'm going to mispronounce his name, so if he ever sees this, I apologize, but Dr. Jan Le Paulin de Waruz, sorry. So he's a geographer from McGill University in Canada. So he's done a map data set on Mennonite colonies in Latin America. And I used specifically his data to create an interactive map, which is this link at the bottom, which just shows all the different Mennonite settlements in Latin America and how they were, their origin points and where they, the mother colonies, how they're connected, and all the different migrations throughout, which again, I'll show that more towards the end. So this is just briefly to show what the actual data looks like in an Excel file. It can look very messy, and in order to get it into a map, it's very complicated, and you have to put it from one data into a different form of data, and so it ends up just being very complicated. But essentially, you just need an identifier, the country it's in, a colony name. He also had alternative names, origin, year, if it was dissolved, the district it's in, and where the origin of the first colonists were, which is essentially where the mother colony is. And this is essentially the same thing. And then there is also coordinates. So again, research question. I came upon the Mennonites particularly when I was traveling through Latin America, and it's very particular. They're a very small percentage of the population in each country they're in: Mexico, Belize, Bolivia, Paraguay, typically just around 1%, 3%, something like that. But they'll dominate one particular agricultural industry. So for example, in Paraguay, they control actually over 50% of the dairy and beef. Dairy, they control, I think, about 80%. But when it's both dairy and beef, it's about 50%. And Paraguay, I think, is within the top 10 exporters of beef in the world. They actually just made a trade agreement with Canada to be able to export beef to Canada. So the Mennonites have actually, even though they're a very small population in Paraguay, they have made a global impact with their beef industry. And I just think this disproportionate impact is so interesting, and I keep trying to come. It's kind of a repeated pattern everywhere there are either Netherlands, Prussia, Russia, Canada, U.S., Mexico, Bolivia, Belize, Paraguay, etc. And I'm so interested in how this has come about, this pattern. So some answers. When I talk with Mennonites themselves, Amish and Mennonites, and I say, well, why, you have such a big farm and, you seem to be doing so well. How did this happen? And the very typical answer will be, we just work hard. Work ethic, though they're also very thrifty. It's thrift, honesty, and work ethic. And that's definitely true. So I'm not excluding any of these other answers when I'm going into in more in depth of my own interpretation from this data. So it's definitely true that their cultural capital of the Mennonite work ethic, which is vis-a-vis the Protestant work ethic from Weber, even though he was focusing more on the Calvinists, that's definitely true. It's definitely has a factor into their success. But I just don't think it's the only thing. Symbolic capital, so preferential treatment. This has been something that's been within the past maybe 50 years. A lot more scholars are focusing on, well, a lot of the land that they were given because they were European or German settlers. And a lot of that land was kind of taken from indigenous tribes. So there is also this idea of government treatment of Amish and Mennonites, at least initially, giving them preferential treatment. And also because of their reputation, which is the symbolic capital part. So they're known as agriculturalists. They have this idea, there's this idea about them of being quintessential farmers. And again, there's also some truth to that, but it's the idea. This has been made, especially, there's a book called Amish in the American Imagination. It kind of ebbs and flows. They're kind of sometimes viewed as like quintessential farmers, sometimes viewed as kind of Luddites. But in general, over time, it's skewed more in the positive direction. Natural capital, so they've also tended to migrate to what happens to be very fertile land. And they've gotten that land typically for free or at very low price. Human capital, I've talked about this before in previous articles and chats. They've been connected to a lot of new innovations, even though they're living in kind of what we would consider third world countries, they have connections to agricultural innovations in Canada, Germany, and the US. And this was true even in the 1800s in Russia. You had German Mennonites, Prussian Mennonites, I guess you would call them, going to German universities and then returning to Russia with new agricultural knowledge, creating new agricultural experimental plots, trying the new tech, the new techniques. And so this has definitely been another aspect and another factor. Social capital. Social capital is essentially their connections. This has been one of the larger answers for a lot of Mennonite anthropologists and sociologists in the past 50 years, particularly one named Dr. Fretz, who basically said that it's primarily because of their mutual aid. They're an ethno-religious community, and even though they live in different parts of the world, they still believe in this concept of brotherhood. And so if they hear about brothers in Russia going through a famine, they'll send aid. And they're much more willing to do that than if they were just sending it to a stranger. I definitely also think there's some truth to this as well. There's a lot of connections that we'll get into, but I don't think it's particularly simply a matter of religious mutual aid. I think there's a little bit something more going on, and that's what I'm getting into, which is another form of social capital, which is the Mennonite world system, is kind of what I'm calling it. And it's based off of Emmanuel Wallerstein's theory of world systems theory, which I'll briefly summarize in the next page. And I'm going to kind of explain how I think it functions with this geographic data that we're going to be going over. So basic world systems theory, even though he has some sort of a connection with Marxian economic theory, it's essentially this idea of what we would call the first world and the third world, or the developed world and the undeveloped world. So in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, he was calling it the world division of labor between the core, so the capital-rich countries, and the periphery, which would be kind of the undeveloped countries where a lot more labor was being performed, a lot more raw materials were getting out of. So he considers it more of an exploitative relationship, but I don't think that's necessarily always the case. I don't think it has to be exploitative, but it can be, definitely. But it's the basic idea that the industry, a lot of the secondary goods are produced in the first world, what he calls the core, and a lot of the labor and materials are taken from the periphery. So what I'm suggesting is that Mennonites have maintained connections to the core, to the capital-rich countries, while existing in peripheral countries and kind of forming their own mini core of industry within each country. So this has to do with the 1500 marks the creation of the capitalist world system. This is, again, kind of Wallerstein's theory. The initial beginning point of the world system is in the Netherlands, which is also kind of where a large portion of the Reformation in Mennonite history takes place. So South Germany and the Netherlands. So it's kind of this coalition of, you have both the origin point of the Mennonites and the origin points of the capitalist world system coalescing at the same point in time. So I'm saying that there's a lot of contingency with Mennonite success because they just kind of happen to develop out of the same time. And it could be a chicken and the egg problem. It could also be that they affected the fact that the origin point of the capitalist system is in the Netherlands. But we'll get that'll be something that we can kind of get into in the Q&A. I think there's definitely some back and forth that can be gotten from that. Eventually, the Dutch hegemony was over, and Wallerstein kind of marks it towards the English hegemony in England, but also, I would say, in the English-speaking world. So in particular, it moves primarily from the Netherlands towards England and then North America vis-a-vis England. This is particularly evident after World War I, where U.S. hegemony is pretty much established, or the beginning of the establishment of U.S. hegemony. And you can kind of tag on Canada and make it North American hegemony because they tend to have that close relationship. So very brief overview of Mennonite migration history. I think probably most everyone is familiar with this in this chat, but just in case they're not, I'm just going to go over it a little bit. So in the 1500s, the Reformation occurs. A lot of Mennonites in Switzerland area, South Germany, Rhineland area, Swiss Mennonites, and then also origin point of the Dutch Mennonites in the Netherlands. So Menno Simons was Dutch Mennonite, even though a lot of the earlier Mennonites were Swiss Mennonites. Even in this beginning point, there's a lot of connections throughout the wars of religion. Mennonites are often persecuted, particularly after the Munster incident, but even regardless of that and their commitment to nonviolence, they're still persecuted fairly harshly at intervals. So anytime that the Dutch Mennonites hear that there's persecution of the French territory or the Switzerland or South German more Catholic regions, that there's persecution of their Swiss Mennonite brethren, they end up offering them aid, and in particular, aid to migrate away from these zones. So a lot of Swiss Mennonites end up migrating up to the Netherlands with aid from their Dutch Mennonite brethren. And then from there, you have two different waves. You have one wave going towards from the Netherlands into England, and then from England into North America. So you end up with, in the 1700s, waves of Swiss Mennonites going to New York, Pennsylvania. This is kind of eventually what becomes the Amish community in the US, and a lot of what we know of as Swiss Mennonites in the US. This is their origin point. Another wave, particularly of Dutch Mennonites a little bit later in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s, end up going eastward towards Prussia. This is both because of persecution, but also following trade networks and following just offers of free or cheap land. So this has become Prussian Mennonites. So this is where a lot of what our Dutch Mennonites end up becoming Prussian German-speaking Mennonites, giving up their Dutch language. And that's where we now associate the Dutch Mennonites becoming Low German or Plattdeutsch Mennonites. Eventually, these Prussian Mennonites, for reasons of both persecution, but also offers of land, end up in Russia and Ukraine under the late 1700s under Catherine the Great. And these are what we now are what we call the Russian Mennonites. So this is just kind of the trajectory, one westward, one eastward. Later on, 1900s, there's another trajectory southward into Latin America from both Canada, US, and then also Russia. So it ends up forming kind of an L of Mennonite migration, or you could say a boomerang or something like that, where it's going over to Russia, even going as far as Siberia, but also going over to Canada, to the east coast of Canada, but also down south. Now they're even as far as the central part, the Pampas, the plains of Argentina. So this is just kind of a map. So you can kind of see it just forms of settlement patterns like an L shape. And this is a very, very popular map used in lots of migrations, presentations. Okay, so how does this function? So as the Netherlands was the core or the origin point of the capitalist system, a lot of Mennonites partook in this. And so you end up with a lot of, there are also plain Mennonites, so we'd call plain Mennonites in the Netherlands at this time. But a lot of Mennonites become engaged in merchant networks, and they become very prosperous in a lot of industries in the Netherlands. There's even, I think, a street, I believe in Amsterdam, it was called Mennonite Lane, and it was all just mansions of just wealthy Mennonite traders. And if we remember that Amsterdam was the commercial hub of both the Dutch Republic and, at this time, of the world economy or the growing European expansion, you can tell that this would also have a great impact on Mennonite wealth at this time. So just a fun factoid, tulip mania, which is when there was a tulip market growth and then crash. It's a very famous economic crash in economic history where they all just started investing in tulips. a lot of Mennonites actually partook in this, and some even built their wealth from it. And then there's just control of linen and silk industries. So why this is important is that a lot of these Dutch Mennonites who became wealthy from this world system, from this introduction of the capitalist system, then provided aid to both South German Swiss Mennonites, but also Prussian Mennonites. So there's this archive right here of lots of letters from Prussian Mennonites to their Dutch Mennonite brethren, asking them for financial aid and also thanking them for financial aid. So this is true both. There's a center point of the kind of periphery of East Prussia being settled by Mennonites and them forming industry there and also a lot of farmland and them receiving aid and also capital investment from Dutch Mennonites. Same thing happens with South German lands. I kind of already went over that. A lot of South German Mennonites were being persecuted. Swiss Mennonites is what we would call them. And they received aid from, in particular, they actually formed an organization called the Dutch Mennonites Commission for Foreign Needs, kind of like a MCC, for those of who know what the MCC is. But in the 1700s, I believe, late 1600s, early 1700s, where the purpose was solely to pool capital from the Netherlands, from Dutch Mennonites, to aid with the resettlement of Swiss Mennonites in the New World. Later on, the Prussian Mennonites kind of formed their own core with the Russian Mennonites. I kind of already talked about that with their innovation networks. A lot of Russian Mennonites traveled to Prussia for both aid and also for studying in Prussia. Johann Cornys is a very famous example. I won't go into him too much, but he's a very popular figure in Russian Mennonite history. He did a lot of education reforms. He did a lot of agricultural reforms. So if you're interested in this, you can look into him. There's a lot of information on him. Then later on, they kind of, as the World Center moved away from Northwest Europe towards the US, you have a lot of now North American Mennonites setting up organizations to help fund and aid and invest in Russian Mennonites. Initially, that was kind of the origin point of the MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, where you have North American Mennonites sending not just aid in terms of food, but also they were sending a lot of tractors and kind of capital in terms of machinery to Russian Mennonites to kind of, after the Russian Revolution, trying to get them back on their feet. Eventually, this is the exact same organization that helped resettle a lot of these Mennonites out of Russia as they were kicked out of Russia in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They would initially go to Prussia, and then from Prussia Prussia, Germany at this time, and then from Germany they would be resettled in both Canada and also a little bit of Mexico and also Paraguay. And then in general, because of their now resettlements in Latin America, in Paraguay and Mexico, you have this same type of connection with a lot of the capital-rich Mennonites in North America, Canada, and the US, sending both aid, but also investments and also just capital flow in general to Mennonite settlements and colonies throughout Latin America. So they're currently in the countries of Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Mexico, Belize. I think those are the major settlements. I think there was a couple attempts in Honduras, and I think there's some in Costa Rica as well, but the main ones are those that I've listed. And it's not just more modern, what we'd call modern conservative Mennonites sending aid. A lot of actually plain Mennonites and plain Amish will set up charity auctions or things like that, collect money, and then loan them to, in particular, New Belizean settlements in the 60s and 70s. A lot of Amish heard that they were struggling, and so they kind of set up their auctions to send them aid and capital. Well, aid in the terms of loan. It was actually a loan that had to be repaid. But still, so it's not simply a distinction between plain and modern. It's more of the territory, the origin they're in, of whether it's a capital-rich region or a capital-poor region. So this is the map you would see in one of those data sets. I'm actually going to go into the actual website in a moment, but just in case you wanted to see briefly, you can see it's not just Ukraine, which is it's more well known. They end up kind of throughout. A lot of them, particularly in Siberia, was unfortunately in the 30s due to the Stalin's repressions, and they ended up in camps here. And so the work camps kind of became settlements, but not all of them. Some of them actually followed the Siberian train and set up kind of their own Mennonite settlements in Siberia in a similar way of trying to get away from modernity by settling in isolated regions. So it's something called the Grand Trek in Russian Mennonite history. That's how you get all these here, and then a lot in Siberia over here. So this is also just a map from Corey Anderson, kind of showing all the plain Anabaptist congregations. So you'll end up with a lot of aid coming from Ohio and Pennsylvania, and then Manitoba, going down southward into Latin America, and then other parts of the U.S. as well. Yeah, so this is just the initial colonies in Paraguay, and then some of the colonies in Belize. There's a couple websites that just have lots of maps of the colonies, but I won't stick on that too long. So origin point of a lot of the ones that originally ended up in Mexico, they ended up in Durango, Chihuahua, but they've since, even within Mexico, they've migrated to Zacatecas, they've migrated to the Yucatan with Campeche. Others have gone to Paraguay, others have gone to Brazil as recently as 2014. I think the most recent migrations and the new colonization efforts have been in Peru and Colombia in just the past couple of years. And a lot of them are Mexican Mennonites who receive a lot of the capital from Canada and North America to then try and purchase new land in either Mexico or get out of Mexico and find cheap land in all of these other locations. And I can talk about how the connection with Canada and the US in getting capital works as well, if you wanted me to in the Q&A. This is a still from my map. This was actually kind of a technical mistake, but I kind of think it's nice in that it shows the connectedness of all the different migrations throughout Latin America. So if you kind of combined all three of the maps, which was kind of an ambition of mine, all the different data sets I've displayed, combining all the Mennonite settlements in Russia, and then also finding maps of the settlements in Germany and the Netherlands, and then combining Dr. Anderson's settlements in North America with all of these different information of settlements in Latin America, you would kind of have a global map of all the Mennonite colonies and settlements and be able to show how they interconnect with each other. So these are migration points. This is when one colony, a group of colonists went from one colony and formed a new settlement. But this can all just as equally show different capital flow. And primarily it's coming a lot from Europe and North America and going towards Latin America, at least in this time. Obviously earlier you'd have something similar, but from Netherlands going either to the US or eastward. Okay, so some conclusions before I show the actual maps online. I have a paragraph. So a couple conclusions. One is that I think that we kind of view the plain Anabaptist or Anabaptism in general. We don't realize how spread out across the globe it is and how it really is more of a global phenomenon, not just as in religious terms with missionaries in other places, but actual settlements and colonization efforts. They really are spread out throughout the world. Even though that they're known for schisms, right? That's kind of a common joke. I've heard it called the Anabaptist disease. Anytime there's an argument, they break apart into two communities. Even though we tend to focus on schisms and the diversity of these communities, which I think is very, very true, I think we shouldn't forget that they also make a lot of connections. And there's also a lot of movement between communities in and out. It's a lot more porous than I think we kind of conceptualize sometimes. and they're connected. Even so, you'll find that they have cousins throughout the world that they'll visit and they know about. And so it's not quite as they're not quite as closed off within each other as I think sometimes we assume, but by their diversity and their history of schisms, I think they're a lot more interconnected than maybe even they themselves would realize. Another conclusion I would say uh, is that kind of what the map shows is that they actually are not just global, but they're a transnational network. They are connected. It's not just the modern versus the plain. It's plain and modern in a core country or a capital-rich country, aiding plain and modern Anabaptists in more of a peripheral or developing country. And so this isn't, I think, the main reason necessarily that they tend to be economically successful, but I think it's probably a combination of all the factors I listed. And I think this is maybe just one that's not always addressed as well, that they hedge their transnational network in order to get capital to set up new developments, new colonies, new projects, new farms, new innovations for farms, to try to go from goat farming to back to cow farming, or et cetera. And I think this is a very important aspect in how they've been able to develop and maintain their new industries, new farms, wherever they end up going. So I think that's kind of the broad conclusion I've gathered from these data sets. And then if I can just figure this out. So yes, so this is the first link I showed, Germans from Russian settlements. If you go down, this is kind of one of the maps. If you click on this map, this will take it to the German website. And so this is much more interactive. So you can
Samuel,
explore
sorry,
it.
we are still seeing the PowerPoint, and
Okay.
I'd love to see the map as you're working through it.
Okay. Let me figure that out real quick.
Elizabeth, I also wanted to bring up the map. You can get a link to it in the chat. He posted as the first. Okay, you noticed that. I've already been playing around with it during the talk.
Yeah, thank you. I copied them already.
I'm going to stop share and then try and reshare with my actual screen so that I can just show it real quick. Okay, now you can see it. Okay, oh, now they're going to YouTube. Great. Okay. Close that. So yeah, if you just go to the Germans from Russian settlement page and you go down, there'll be this map. Under it, you can click on this link and it'll actually take you to a Google Maps that was created with all the information, and you can kind of explore it a little bit. And you can see it goes pretty much almost as far as, like, it's parallel with North Korea, some of these settlements. These were probably also Siberian work camps, but still, you don't realize how far they went. And you also don't realize how far into the Middle East they went. You have a couple settlements that ended up being failed settlements, but even in Turkmenistan, I think that one is technically Iran. And if you click on them, so not all of these are Mennonite closed colonies. Some of them are closed colonies. Some of them are just settlements that had Mennonite populations in them. So it'd be a minority population, maybe 10%. Sometimes they would be a majority population, 80%. So it's a mixture of just the settlements and the colonies. If you click on them, it'll show you a little bit of information. Unfortunately, this is all in German, but I think you can figure it out. And I believe on the website, it's not on this map, but on the website, they have actually articles that give a brief explanation of the history of each settlement as well. So that's one map. And then another map you can kind of play with is this one, which I like how it's colored, because it actually, you show that the Mennonite colonies in Paraguay, you can see them like from space pretty much. Like, that's how big of a territory they are. And then these ones, if you click on them, they should highlight. If you click on them, they'll give you a bit of information and a link to the Gameo website, which has an article on those colonies. So those are the main ones, but even smaller ones should have a link to some sort of small article that gives just the bare basic information of it. And Gameo is a website that can also be, it's like Wikipedia for Mennonites, in case you're not aware. So this is one of those things where ideally, if you had other information, like you knew in particular about, let's say, the Monte Claro colony, and you saw that that article was fairly empty, you could then suggest edits and say, okay, well, either corrections or just provide more information. And I think that'd be a very cool idea to kind of expand out all the information we have for all these colonies. So yeah, I think I've probably gone way over time, but that's the basics of the data sets and the conclusions I kind of draw from the data. So I'm open for any questions anyone might have now.